Hello everyone. The topic of our webinar today is all about working smarter and not harder. This is a great rule to live by, and today we will be using the context of device lifecycle management to frame the conversation. My name is Curtis Armstrong, and I'm a K-12 education field sales engineer here at Jamf, and I'm very excited to be here today talking to you. At Jamf, we are here to help you succeed with Apple. So let us know if there's anything that we can do for you. Let's cover a little bit about today's agenda. We'll be covering a variety of topics, including, but not limited, to the device lifecycle management. We'll cover device collection, reviewing settings and goals for technology in the classroom, testing our workflows, deployment, redeployment, and retirement of devices, and touch on some helpful tools for teachers, students, and parents along the way. When we think about device lifecycle in education, it generally looks a lot like what's building out here. We need to make that initial purchase of devices, and then we plan by building out our requirements and our assignments and our settings and all of those fun things. And then we test, and maybe we test again, and hopefully we test one more time. And I resisted putting 3 test bubbles in there because that's how important I feel that part of the process is. Then, hooray, we deploy the devices out to our end users. This is an exciting, happy, and probably somewhat stressful day. And then throughout the year, we need to maintain because things do change. And maybe we have users that leave, new users that show up, new apps and settings are requested, apps and settings are requested to be removed. Maybe we need to change a few things along the way, but that's all good because that's why Jamf is such a powerful tool. We can do that midstream. Now, as we approach the end of the year, you typically collect devices, at least for those students that are moving on. Let's take the purchase component out for now. And here's the cycle for the foreseeable future. But eventually, you're going to be looking to retire some of those devices that you've collected, hopefully for new Apple hardware. And if those devices have reached the end of their life with you, you'll want to offboard them, retire them, and pass them on to someone else. You have several options in doing this, like selling them to a company like Diamond Assets, for example, or passing them on to your community. Either way, there's tasks that need to be accomplished with that workflow as well. But let's cycle back to that planning aspect for a moment. Because planning is, without a doubt, one of the most important components, and it's what lays it out for your testing to come up. And it's one of those processes that's often overlooked. So what are your goals for this new technology? What settings are required? Which apps do you need? How do you kind of maintain the Jamf component of it, the Apple School Manager component of it, as well as all the things that need to happen on that device? So let's dive in a little bit to that first one called the requirements review. So what are your requirements? Do you have them written out somewhere, or is it just sort of grown over time? Are there state or federal or district or school specific requirements for computing devices, such as passcodes, encryption, applications, restricted applications? And what are the goals for the technology in the classroom? That's the whole reason those devices are there. Do teachers have the apps and classroom tools like Jamf Teacher and Apple Classroom that they want to use to improve the use of technology in the classroom? It's more important than ever to make sure that you're coordinating this requirements review with all facets of your community, so leadership and curriculum teams, just to ensure that everything is articulated sooner rather than later. Now, as we dive into some specifics a little bit around the Jamf settings, what are your configuration profiles? You need something new added in. You've got policies in there for Jamf Pro, the scripts and the packages in Pro and School, applications, and we even need to kind of talk about that onboarding experience, right? We'll dive into that a little bit as well. But we're going to look for different things. And specifically when you're talking about configuration profiles, it's always good to review that scope, especially if you're, reusing configuration profiles year after year. That scope may have changed not changed itself, but been changed a little bit. So make sure that that falls in line. General housekeeping, like you have duplicate profiles in there doing the same thing. While that not inherently technically bad, it's messy. We can clean that up. Also, a huge fan of the descriptions for configuration profiles. I make a lot of profiles. I'm not always sure what they all do just by the title that I give them. So adding that description field not only helps you, but helps your teammates to understand what those profiles do to make it easy from a troubleshooting perspective. Oh, apps, yay. Plan these as part of your requirements review. Know which apps are considered required versus optional or nice to have. Now, over time, you've probably acquired a lot of apps through Apple School Manager, and there's probably a lot of those that you are no longer using. It's a good idea in Apple School Manager to create an app warehouse location and move those unused or excess licenses over into that so they're not, taking up space on your purchasing an apps and books token that's inside of Jamf. It makes things cleaner as well. Of course, make sure you have enough licenses. And if you're adding devices, make sure that you're getting that requisite number of increase in your applications that you are scoping to those devices or to all devices or to your self-service and on-demand options. Jamf Pro also has a nice feature called categories to allow you to group by category those applications, even configuration profiles and policies that kind of spread across the whole product. And that's great for the self-service application too, for those sort of self-service or on-demand applications to put them into their appropriate categories to making them easier to find for your end users. Let's not forget about our tokens, always important. A yearly cycle, at least. Apple push notifications, MDM server tokens, formerly known as DEP, as well as apps and books location tokens, formerly known as VPP, all have a 1-year expiration date. Important note about the APNS is that needs to be renewed by the same Apple ID that created it. So make sure that you're making notes of this. Both Jamf School, Jamf Pro have notifications that alert you when your tokens are nearing expiration, but my pro tip of the day is to create calendar reminders, possibly on a group calendar or shared calendar, reminding you to renew those tokens maybe 30 or even 60 days out. Now, when we can get applications for Mac OS from the Mac App Store, that makes it really, really easy. And in Jamf Pro, we've also added the new installers, app installers, which make distributing those package-based applications really easy. And we've also got the patch manager importing inside of Pro. But either way, whether it's Pro or School, this is things that you want to make sure that you're keeping up on. A lot of those applications update frequently. You'll want to make sure that your users are accessing or getting access to those newest versions of those applications from a security perspective. So let's dive into the classroom a little bit. There's some wonderful tools out there, and we'll talk about how to kind of set up and make sure that your users, your teachers and your students have access to these tools in a timely manner. The teacher app available from Jamf for both School and Pro is a wonderful resource that goes very well with Apple's Classroom app as well. And then there's self-service for those on-demand style of applications and resources. From a student perspective, again, self-service is a great tool to get those just-in-time applications. And then the Jamf School student app serves that role for those on-demand applications, along with messaging and a lot of other really great features on the Jamf School side for that student. Stepping kind of out of the classroom for a moment, I do want to touch on the parent app that is available for both Pro and Jamf School, and is a wonderful resource that empowers parents at home with their iOS or their Android device to have a little bit of mini management of those student iPads while those students are at home. So here we are, big days approaching. We are ready for deployment. We've thought about our strategies, like how we're going to roll those out, groups built out for application and configurations, classroom needs, classroom tools. We think we are all ready to go. So in that process, we've talked a little bit about how we are going to deploy those devices. What rollout strategy are we using? And there's really two fundamental things to consider, whether IT does it all or the end user does it all. But I will admit that there is sort of a hybrid of those in between too, that you can kind of merge these two together to have some set up by IT, some set up by the end user. So what are the benefits, right? When we consider the IT side of things, it gives that IT team total control of the process. It can set the cadence, what they're doing, how they're doing it, where they're doing it, the ability to pull a device out of the workflow if it's misbehaving from a triage perspective. This also opens the door up for the potential use of a tool like Configurator to help expedite that onboarding process without all of the demands on the Wi-Fi network. So if you have the right tools for that, that's a great approach to take in certain use cases. Now, if we transition that setup over to the user, to the end user, we distribute that workload tremendously, going from just a few to many. You also introduce options for authentication, which we'll talk about in a sec. During that onboarding process, it's important to consider that when you have a lot of devices being set up by a lot of users with a lot of apps coming down all simultaneously, that can cause some congestion on your Wi-Fi network. So something to keep in mind when you're considering that end user approach. So one of the important things is assigning a device to a user. If you're in a one-to-one environment, we really want to know, and Jamf needs to know, but it's helpful to know who has that device. So there's actually 3 scenarios where we can associate a user to a device: before, during, and after that enrollment of that device. So from a before standpoint, we've got really an option in each of our products, Jamf School and Jamf Pro, device placeholders in School and inventory preload in Pro. And they both serve a very similar purpose. Is you can upload a list of serial numbers with static attributes, including username and information associated to each one of those devices. And when that device enrolls, it will apply those attributes to the device record in your respective Jamf setup. We also have an option during, as I mentioned earlier, and you can introduce an extra screen in the enrollment process that prompts for authentication. Once the user has authenticated with their username and password, they are then associated to that device in Jamf. We also have an opportunity to associate a device to a user after enrollment's done. Now, it may seem counterintuitive that you see inventory preload for a post-event there, but suffice to say, inventory preload will take those attributes that you upload even after and attribute them to a device record, including the user assignment. In School, you can do a straightforward CSV import that associates a device to a user. We also have a cool little feature in School that's an Azure web clip. So after that device has been set up, if that device is not associated to a user, that web clip appears, prompts the user to authenticate with their Azure AD credentials, and then associates that user to the device. But we're not all the way there yet. We have the device associated to the user, and that's a huge first step. But if we want to make use of some of those classroom tools, we also have to know about the classes that those users participate in. So a typical workflow generally consists of using Apple School Manager and syncing that with your supported SIS or leveraging an SFTP import. There are also tools out there and companies that can help you automate that process, like Salamander Soft and Claris Connect. Once you have that information in ASM, that syncs with your Jamf School or your Jamf Pro instance, pulling in those classes, those users, the rosters, all of the information needed to build that out. And once you have that, automatically, we can deploy the Jamf Teacher, Jamf Student app for school, Teacher app for Pro, and of course, Apple Classroom as well for those teacher devices to manage those student devices in the classroom. So now we have all of that built out. Now, I talked about a lot of different little tools kind of quickly there. I want to mention some in detail. For Jamf Pro, there is a Mac app out there called the MUT, M-U-T, Multi-Update Tool. And if you're not familiar with this, I highly, highly recommend it. It's a whole ton of fun, fun being relative. But if you love CSV imports as much as I do, it's fun. And it allows you to make adjustments to those device records and user records inside of Jamf Pro. There's also that inventory preload CSV and settings that I mentioned that allows you to send up a list ahead of or after those devices have been enrolled. And then on the Jamf School side, we have the placeholders CSV, as well as user CSVs that we can use to associate those devices to users and set some of those static attributes. So let's talk about app deployment for a moment. And again, I'm going to break this into sort of a familiar options screen here. Automatic versus self-service or on-demand. What are the values? What are the benefits of some of these options? Automatic, I like to consider this your baseline configuration. This is what the device or the groups of devices or all the devices must have in your organization, as defined by your requirements review that we talked about earlier, right? Now, sending out a large command to lots of devices to install lots of apps simultaneously, again, can impact your network, so you want to take that into consideration with the automatic installation part. I also see huge value in the self-service or on-demand options in Pro and School. This is for your optional apps, the nice to haves, the just-in-time apps that you need and you can get when you need it. And in effect, this becomes your school's curated app store. It allows users to browse through what you have made available that you're allowed and they're allowed to install on that device. This also can lower your network demand because there aren't a lot of synchronous commands that are being sent out simultaneously to all those devices because users grab those applications when and where they need them. So as we touch back on this lifecycle management, I want to focus in on a couple elements as we wrap up. Next, collection. We're going to focus in a little bit on that. And I'm going to let a workflow, a very general workflow play out here as I talk about it. And so when we collect devices, make sure that we are inspecting them, right? Even if you're going to hand it right back to a user, always incorporate inspection into your yearly workflows, especially with regards to warranties and things like that. Now, you've, again, got options here. I'd say probably 50% of the schools that I work with collect all of their devices, erase them all, charge them, and store them for the summer. And then repeat that process in reverse on the other end of the start of school. I'd say the other half of them take the approach of, I'm going to erase the devices that aren't going back to the students because those students are moving on. And then for the returning students, maybe just clear the passcode, update the device, charge it up, shut it down, put it away with the intent to hand it back to that same student at the end of the year. So you've got a few options there in terms of how you're working through that collection phase. But I will say inspection is always important. And then let's focus finally on the retiring aspect of the devices or offboarding those devices out of your organization. So at a high level, following this order of operations will help ensure a smooth transition of those devices out of both Jamf and Apple School Manager. First, we need to identify those devices to retire. We can use groups, whether those be static groups of a list of known serial numbers or smart groups based on things like a device model, for example. We're going to unassign those devices from Apple School Manager to ensure that they don't roll back into Jamf if they're erased. Also consider secure erase options for macOS if your organization requires it. Remove those records from Jamf. Why? To free up the licenses. And then once the dust is settled, we can release them from Apple School Manager. So there is a great webinar all around that retirement process that I'd highly recommend and is definitely worth checking out. So let's recap. Each stage of the device lifecycle contains opportunities to work smarter and not harder. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join me today.